Wonderful. Thank you so much to the Socialist Alliance and the Green Left. Um, we've been, of course, through hell over the last few weeks. It's been extremely tense. And what I thought I would do today in the conversation is to give a little bit of a background, um, both in terms of what's been happening historically in India and Pakistan, and of course Kashmir, and also what were the recent triggers of this current conflict and what to expect in the future. Um, so um, Pakistan, India historically have had tense relations. Of course, the Pakistan comes out of a partition of the subcontinent in 1947, and this partition has its roots in colonialism. Like everything, Europe is at the heart of the problem. Um, in 1947, at the partition, the relations immediately soured over how to partition the regions. Where would the boundaries be drawn? And the most lasting uh, kind of reminder of that conflict is, of course, the disputed territory of Kashmir. And I believe there are comrades from Kashmir who can talk more about that situation. But as early as 1948, Pakistan and India went to war on Kashmir, and India, of course, occupied most of the region, and the will of the Kashmiri people was not respected, despite the fact that the United Nations has a resolution from 1948 demanding a referendum in the region, a plebiscite, so that the people of Kashmir can decide on their future. Um, so a little bit of about the changes that have taken place in both these countries. Now, Comrade was just talking about Indian comrades finding it hard to join this meeting today. Now, this is a remarkable shift that has happened in India over the past 78 years. And we in Pakistan, at one point, there were a lot of liberals, leftists in Pakistan would point towards India and say, this is an example of a democracy, of a secular government relative to what was happening in Pakistan. Today, it is very difficult, even for left parties, to talk on this issue, to work with comrades from Pakistan, and to take a stand against the current government, the current regime in India. This is a remarkable shift because India in the 1950s, 60s, with all its problems, with all its contradictions, was very much rooted in the tradition of third worldism. And this was, of course, Nehru's vision to create third world solidarity. He was one of the architects of the conference in Bandung in 1955 in Indonesia, which brought together third world leaders from Nasser to Sukarno to Chou Enlai from China. And of course, Nehru was very central to that project. India also happened to be one of the biggest supporters of the Palestinian cause on the international stage and had very close relations with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. In fact, India did not have an Israeli embassy until 1992. So this was the very much part of this anti-colonial third worldist ideas. So in a way, this was the momentum of the anti-colonial movement from the 90s, 20s, and 30s kind of reflected itself in the state formation that took place. This is not to suggest that this was a radical socialist state. There was a lot of repression against workers and peasants, particularly against the communist parties. The police and even the military was used quite regularly against dissidents, particularly again against farmers, peasants, but also Muslims. And Kashmir uh, kept facing erasure, no matter who the government, who was in charge of government in Delhi. So these contradictions were there within this Nehruvian project. However, it is only in the 1970s, 1980s that you have the rise of the Hindu far right. And this is a peculiar beast because in 1984, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is now in power, it was a new party that got only 2 seats in 1984. But within 10 years, it became one of the largest parties. And one of the reasons for its spectacular rise in popularity was this incident in 1991-92, where they organized mass demonstrations across the country to demolish a mosque, which they believed had been built in the 16th century on a temple. And this was mass mobilization, an unheard of situation where a religious site was a target of public agitation for months. It led to spectacular forms of violence, communal riots across India, but it also allowed the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, to become a mainstream party. So they became what the unfortunate thing that happened is that uh, electoral gains became tied to communal violence, to extremism. The more you had, the more communal violence, religious strife that you saw take shape in the public domain, the more votes were guaranteed to the far right. And this is, of course, a template from the 1920s and 30s that fascists have used. This rise of Hindutva, this Hindu extremism ideology is called Hindutva, uh, coincided with the dismantling of the welfare state, the dismantling of the third worldist state within India, and the advent of neoliberalism and corporate culture in India in the 1990s. So it's called the liberalization of the economy under the Congress government. And very soon, these new corporate elites, both global and local, realized that in order to fend off challenges from the left, it would be important to have goons from the right. And this, again, is a classic kind of a corporate fascist alliance that we saw in Italy in the 1920s and Germany in the 1930s, that fascists initially were strikebreakers. And this alliance kind of cemented in India as well in the 90s and 2000s. One more thing that happened is that this pivot towards religious fundamentalism and neoliberalism also facilitated closer ties between India and the US. India was part of the non-aligned movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But at this point, in the 2000s and 2010s, um, India started gravitating towards the American camp. And America needed India as part of its containment strategy against China in Asia. Recently, Modi met Trump. This was in February at the White House. And they signed a 10-year strategic partnership, a military partnership, and the statement suggested that US and Indian military interests converged in the region. So that's the language they used. And this convergence is basically over China, an attempt to create a siege around China. And that's, of course, a topic that many of you are familiar with. Not only did India move closer in the American camp, but also it developed relations with Israel. As I said, until the 1980s, India was one of the biggest supporters of Palestine on the global stage. But by 2010s, India moved towards Israel, developed very close ties, and not only did they develop economic ties, they also developed military ties with Israel, including becoming one of the biggest importers of Israeli weapons in the world. So the link between the Indian military and the Israeli defense industry, it remains very intimate. Now, this is the story of India, the changes that have taken place, which eventually led, and the not only led to this kind of constant animosity with Pakistan and with Muslims, which now leads to electoral dividends for the ruling party, but also led to further right-wing shifts within this far-right party. So from Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the first prime minister of the BJP and had some kind of understanding of working with the opposition, now you have someone who was banned by the US and other countries, who wasn't allowed entry into these countries when he was chief minister of Gujarat, because he was accused of killing thousands of Muslims as chief minister. So you can see the right-wing shift within the organizations as well. It's almost like the Republican Party moving from Bush to Trump, and God knows who will be next. So this is like the ultimate monster that we're seeing in India. Pakistan, on the other hand, joined the American camp very early on in the 1950s. We became a frontline state in America's containment strategy, Cold War containment strategy in the region. We signed two pacts, CETO and CENTO, which were two military pacts with the US. And part of the entire history of Pakistan includes a counterinsurgency, both at home against communists, but also facilitating American presence in the region, including, of course, most infamously in the so-called Afghan Jihad of the 1980s, where good people such as Osama bin Laden and others were facilitated by the CIA and were sent into Afghanistan to fight against the socialist government in Afghanistan, which was doing, with all its faults, it was doing incredible reforms, including reforms in the education system, including land reforms, including allowing women to not only enter the public space, but also facilitating their rise to the top in the political sphere, including the vice president of Afghanistan in the 1980s under the socialist government was a woman. And now you have a situation where women are not allowed to go to school, and these forces that transformed Afghanistan were facilitated by the CIA, trained by the CIA, and Pakistan became kind of a base camp for their operations. In the 1990s, two things happened, which again are related to the current crisis. One is the mass uprising in Kashmir after 1987, when the elections were rigged in Kashmir by the Indian state, and you had a mass uprising which by 1989 turned into a militant struggle for freedom. This was led by the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front. India's crackdown on the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front was brutal. Of course, as we now know, torture, extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, all of this was part of the strategies deployed by the Indian armed forces. And Pakistan began supporting JKLF and the liberation struggle in Kashmir in the 90s. Now, Pakistan was not only supporting the movement, it also tried developing a hegemony over the movement. So there also are a lot of tensions between Pakistan's strategy and the strategy of Kashmiris. And again, the Kashmiri comrade can maybe talk about it in more detail. But one of the salient features of Pakistan's strategy was to send the Mujahideen, the religious fighters fighting in Afghanistan, who were trained by the US, to reorient them and send them to Kashmir. This is also a time when Pakistan was sending fighters to Chechnya, Bosnia, Iran, and different parts of the world. So it became kind of like this hotbed for the Mujahideen, for jihadis in the region. Now, all of this had to be reversed after 9/11, when Pakistan once again became a frontline state for the US, but this time now against the monsters created by the US. And this kind of a chaotic planning and shifting of policies has damaged Pakistan's capacity for any long-term strategic thinking, because Pakistan became more and more reliant on the war dollars that were coming in from the US, whether it was in the containment strategy against communists, whether it was for the Afghan jihad, or after 9/11 when the war on terror was unleashed by the US. At this point, the problem for Pakistan was that these militant groups were embedded within the state. They were embedded in society, in civil society, in the ideological apparatuses. So despite the fact that the Pakistani state tried to undermine them, they had too many informal networks, which meant that this was a bloodbath in which over 70,000 Pakistanis were killed. The economy was damaged, and yet the problem of terror remains, which now brings us to the incident that triggered this fight between India and Pakistan, this latest round, which is the Pahalgam incident, where 26 tourists were gunned down by militants in Kashmir. Pakistan, in my opinion, rightly claims that this is not something that was planned by Pakistan. We have reason to believe that, because many of these groups do not work within the ambit of the Pakistani state anymore. And as I suggested, they've killed Pakistan's military personnel, they've killed Pakistani civilians, including butchering school children in 2014 in Pakistan and Peshawar. So there's that history that's part of the post-war on terror dynamics. The other thing is that Pakistan is embroiled in all kinds of internal crises, including the fact that the current government lacks legitimacy. The elections last year were rigged against Imran Khan's party, and they were rigged in a very clumsy way. So it's a very obviously rigged election, and a government that no longer is seen by the people of Pakistan as legitimate. And the armed forces were also at their lowest in terms of approval ratings. Pakistan also is going through an economic crisis with over 40% of the people living below poverty line. And these are the reasons why the Pakistani government immediately asked for investigation, either a bilateral investigation into Pahalgam or an international investigation. However, the mood on the Indian side kind of shocked all of us here. It was very clear that the Indian state was not in any kind of mood for dialogue, for investigation. They said, the time for investigation is over, it's time for action. Now, the problem with any kind of action on international issues is that you have to set the parameters, and that those parameters for the action to be taken cannot be held unless you are talking to each other. That wasn't done. They were not talking. They were refusing to talk to Pakistan. They were refusing to talk to the international community. And in fact, if you look at the rhetoric of the Indian government after Pahalgam, it was very similar to the rhetoric of the Israeli state. They were acting as judge, jury, and executioner. You look at the BJP spokespeople who are saying this is our 7th October. It is time to reduce Pakistan to rubble. There was all kinds of inferences being made between what happened in Gaza and what should happen to Pakistan. They were also very upset that the world was not supporting them like the world supported Israel. They also immediately indulged in collective punishment by suspending the Indus Water Treaty, which is this water sharing agreement that Pakistan and India signed in 1960. So suspending that means that this is an attempt to collectively punish the people of Pakistan, and this was said in so many words by the Indian government. Similarly, repeatedly, officials of the Indian government said that it's time to break Pakistan into 4 pieces. So the rhetoric from the Indian side leading up to the first week of May was extremely belligerent. And yet many people in Pakistan and across the world were hoping that this would just be this is just rhetoric for domestic audiences, and nobody would be foolish enough to begin a kinetic war when both sides have nuclear weapons. We were proven wrong on the 7th of May. Attacks were launched on Pakistan, uh, uh, and including by the Indian Air Force. The Pakistani Air Force retaliated. Next day, the next 2 days were horrifying. We had Israeli-made drones flying over Pakistan, attacking different sites. 31 civilians were killed, including a child. This was this was a moment of extreme anxiety because I think people had underestimated the belligerence of the Modi regime, uh, and then the fact now it makes more sense because if it gives you electoral dividends, if it can distract the public from the local issues, internal issues, then this is something that a fascist would do. The Pakistan Air Force eventually retaliated on the morning of the 10th of May. This was one of the most difficult nights for people of Pakistan because despite the fact that we have extreme criticisms of our military, and I have a sedition case from the state against me, which carries a life sentence. However, on that night, we all were hoping that the Air Force will be able to defend the country, and that's because of what we've seen in the Middle East. If you're facing a country that wants to be a regional hegemon that is getting its military support from the US and from Israel, and that has in so many words stated that we will reduce the cities of Pakistan to Gaza, then of course negotiations no longer remains a possibility. One has to negotiate from a position of strength. Luckily, the battle kind of reestablished the equilibrium, the military equilibrium. India lost about 6 aircrafts, including the famous Rafales, the French fighters. And this is a subtext, and I'll just conclude in a minute. But there's a subtext to this battle that the Indian side was using French weapons, and the Pakistani side was using Chinese J-10s. And right now there's euphoria in Pakistan and in China because the J-10s were able to outmaneuver and outclass the French jets. And that has kind of changed the equilibrium because this was on the night of the 9th. People were saying, including defense analysts all over the world, and all of us had become defense analysts, or at least we were trying to be, because we were reading all these debates that were taking place in the global media and amongst defense circles. And the idea was that Pakistani Air Force is no match for the Indian Air Force. But on the 10th, when the Pakistani Air Force was able to show its teeth, that kind of created this equilibrium. And on the same day, a tenuous ceasefire was achieved. Now, just to conclude, a ceasefire has been achieved, but you cannot have a long-term ceasefire, long-term peace without in dealing with the primary question, the primary contradiction, which is justice for the people of Kashmir, a just resolution for the Kashmir crisis, including the right to self-determination. That's something that both India and Pakistan will have to agree upon. Kashmir remains under a brutal military occupation. On both sides, people are unhappy, but on the Indian side, of course, the violence, the scale of violence is truly horrific. There has to be a settlement over the issue of Kashmir. The second point to remember is that these wars, these external wars, the moment they ended, they were shifted towards internal enemies. In Pakistan, we had arrests in Gilgit-Baltistan, which is linked to Kashmir, people who were fighting for basic rights, such as the right to own their lands. There's a new law that the Pakistani state is bringing, which will deprive locals of land ownership. Similarly, there were arrests made in Sindh, people who were fighting for saving River Indus and fighting against the ecological destruction taking place. I mean, these are just examples of the wars within. India, of course, has arrested a number of people, including a good friend of mine, a Muslim professor who's teaching at Ashoka University, who's been arrested for sedition just because his name is Ali Khan Mahmoodabad, and his only crime was that he supported the operation. He was pro-military. However, he also added one thing on his Facebook status saying that I hope you now start respecting Muslims, seeing that Muslims are participating in this war effort. And for this Facebook post, he's now in jail. So you should be careful of what you post on Facebook. So it can lead to serious charges. What's happening is that the real wars for both these states are still internal, not external. And these are against people who are raising their voices for human rights, for economic justice, for political justice, for social justice, for environmental justice. These wars within continue to rage. And one of the tasks for left-wing forces, for socialist forces in the region, is to divert this kind of war hysteria that's going on at the moment, which is an attempt by the ruling classes to distract us from the real crisis, to fight this diversion and to reorient our focus on the real crisis that we're facing, which is 40% of people live below poverty line in the subcontinent. Malnourishment is over 30%. In Pakistan, 25 million children are out of school. The social indicators in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal are also horrific. The real wars that we need to fight are wars on poverty, underdevelopment, illiteracy, disease, and political authoritarianism. Those are the big wars that need to be fought. And I think it's time that this crisis has reminded us of the urgency of building the socialist movement in the subcontinent, and also the importance of talking across the border of socialists filling the vacuum where the bourgeoisie has failed, which is that they're unwilling to talk to people on the other side. Socialists will have to talk to each other. And I would like to thank the Green Left and the Socialist Alliance for historically providing us the opportunity to speak to our comrades from India and elsewhere. And that's a tradition we should continue and deepen. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, comrade. No, I really enjoyed the discussion and the comments and the questions. And I've tried to kind of do a chronological kind of story narrative to answer some of the questions. One of the comrades asked about Europe's role, and I kind of hinted at it in my talk, that at the origin of almost any problem in the third world, you can see Europe in the background. And that's true for Pakistan and India. That's true for, of course, what's happening in the Middle East, not just the genocide in Gaza, but the overall kind of collapse of Arab states throughout the region. And 1940s, in that sense, is an interesting moment because there are not just the partition of the subcontinent, but you also have partitioning as a method that's used in the third world quite commonly. You have the partitioning of Vietnam, of Korea, or in many partitions in the Middle East, and also, of course, the partitioning of Europe and Berlin. So this was kind of like one of the solutions that was used by European powers in the 40s to manage the crisis that was emerging in different parts of the world. In India, in particular, in the Indian subcontinent, you had two simultaneous roles played by the British. One was the absolute loot and plunder that happened in the subcontinent. Professor Utsa Patnaik has done fantastic work on it, and she has estimated that Britain stole about $45 trillion, $45 trillion from the Indian subcontinent under colonialism. This is, of course, in contemporary terms. So right now, Pakistan has to beg the IMF for bailouts worth $2 billion or $3 billion. And for that, we are forced to administer austerity, which includes cuts to health, cuts to education, cuts to social welfare. With 25 million children out of school, we're expected to cut our education budget for $2 billion, $3 billion. And it's always seen as this example of extreme generosity by the West. On the other hand, 45 trillion, which includes trillions owed to Pakistan, they were never paid to the region. This is the reason why the Industrial Revolution almost like takes off the moment Britain enters India in the 18th century. And over this period, by 1947, India is, of course, one of the most industrialized countries in the world. And literacy in Britain is almost 100%, whereas the Indian subcontinent is one of the poorest regions in the world. Also, the literacy rate in the subcontinent was around 13-14%. So the same rulers, the same British were ruling these regions. They were ruling Britain and they were ruling the subcontinent. But you can see how the colonies were being used to subsidize the development of the metropole. It was not, we were not generally underdeveloped or historically underdeveloped. Underdevelopment was imposed upon us so that Europe could develop. Michael Parenti has this phrase that the third world is not poor, it is overexploited. And that kind of sums up that it is an overexploited region. And this continues, this weight of history continues till today. With IMF and the conditionalities, the structural adjustment programs that are imposed on the region. And within this colonial history, you also have the emergence of an administrative regime that differentiates between communities on the basis of religion. This started happening in the 19th century. And throughout the 20th century, in the first half of it, this was part of a policy by the British. So the very emergence of nationalism in the subcontinent was fractured and was competing. These were competing forms of nationalism. Now, one can go into further details, and I can maybe if this time I get my visa, we'll get the opportunity to chat more about with the formation of the anti-colonial movements in the subcontinent. But these fractures were very much part of a colonial design, the underdevelopment and the fracturing of society. This was not just the strategy in the subcontinent. This was the strategy in Africa, in other parts of Asia, in the Middle East. I mean, in Africa, as you know, at the Berlin Conference, the lines that were drawn to partition Africa were drawn by white people who had never been to Africa. And no local African was even asked about those lines, about the carving out of Africa. This kind of dehumanization is part of this history. And this continues again in the case of India and Pakistan. The weapons that are being provided, as I said, Pakistan was a frontline state for the US, and part of the reason why we facilitated these militant groups was because we were playing that role for the US in the region. And this Eventually, these groups that ended up bombing our markets, our hospitals, our schools were not indigenous movements. I mean, this is something that has to be reiterated again and again. These were heavily funded organizations funded by Saudi Arabia and the US in order to reverse the gains made by the left in the 70s and 80s. This was part of a counter-revolutionary strategy of empire, a global counterinsurgency against trade unionists, against women's rights activists, against farmers' organizations, and against socialist governments. Remember, Afghanistan had a socialist government. Very few European governments have seen the Communist Party come to power. Afghanistan saw that, and it, instead of getting any kind of aid, it saw this global counter-revolution organized, orchestrated by the West, giving aid to people who were opposed to women going to school, let alone becoming major political figures in the region. So our problems are not all indigenous. Our problems are not unique to us. They're part of a global history in which the West plays a very crucial part, which kind of also addresses one of the questions raised by Comrade Saiba, which was on the reasons that these groups emerge in places like Pakistan. Every country and every region sees its own version of the far right. And that's how it's important to categorize the far right militant groups in Pakistan. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has its own reasons. Punjab has its own reasons. But these are not mass indigenous movements. These were counter movements supported by the Pakistani state and the CIA to repress the actual movements that were taking place, including the militancy of labor and farmers and students in the 60s and 70s, which became the precise target of these CIA-backed movements, including the coup in 1977, orchestrated by General Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, which kind of began this counter-revolution within the country. So that kind of shows this intimate relationship between Western capitals and the crisis we see. And you see, the problem with the West is the clock starts ticking when the crisis reaches the West, when it boomerangs. So 9/11 is when people woke up to extremism, and then countries like Pakistan were ordered to just end extremism, as if it's a switch that you can turn off, as if those groups don't have deep roots by that time, not just in parts of society, but also in parts of the state. And that is part of the problem that we've faced here in Pakistan, this kind of externally oriented repivoting that was imposed upon us, which meant that we became part of someone else's story, and we were merely a footnote in that. And that's created all kinds of problems since the war on terror. In terms of Russia's role, there was a question asked on Russia. So India was a buyer of Russian weapons. Pakistan has never had close relations with Russia, but India was one of the major importers of Russian weapons. But in the last few years, it reoriented itself towards the West. And in the last 3-4 years, in particular, since Ukraine, India was discouraged by the US to buy weapons from Russia. So it's buying weapons from companies that supply weapons to NATO. In terms of but the other subtext continues, the kind of rivalry that you see between China and the West. That one of the problems that the current relationship between the West and India imposes on countries like Pakistan is that while the US is interested in propping up India against China, countries like Pakistan cannot allow the military equilibrium to fall apart. Now, with all our critiques of the military in Pakistan, and we write about that all the time, uh, a situation after the 22nd of April, if you can imagine a situation where the Pakistani military was not organized or was not armed, uh, we might still be seeing this war continue, because uh, the social media trap that the far right in India placed itself in was such that they had to show results. And the results that they were saying they will show is turning Pakistan into rubble, all our major cities. And this was being aired on major television channels. Mainstream corporate media was showing these AI images of what they're about to do to Pakistan. And the only way to attain peace at that moment was to show strength. And that's part of the lesson that we have learned in the Middle East as well. So this was the tragic dimension of the situation. But as Comrade Peter raised this question in terms of the difference in the perception of this conflict in India and Pakistan, I think the perceptions were widely different. In India, there was this pressure to not only condemn Pahalgam, but also to support the Operation Sindoor, it was called, to support the Indian attack on Pakistan. And we have a policy of not commenting on the Communist parties of India. I feel they have to sort this thing out internally, and I think we should talk to progressive forces on the Indian side and move towards some kind of a common thread. On the Pakistani side, however, there was no appetite for war. There is no appetite for war, because there's a general exhaustion because of the economy, because of the political crisis. And thus, you did not really need any kind of a mass anti-war movement in Pakistan, because the Pakistani state itself was taking a very anti-war position. It immediately condemned Pahalgam. It immediately offered negotiations. It immediately offered investigation by international observers. It immediately offered to take action based on any findings by international observers or by the investigation by international observers. And it did not retaliate to the suspension of the water treaty. And even on the 6th of May, the Pakistani state was calling for negotiations. So in such a situation, of course, it was clear that they were reflecting the general sentiment in society, which was that, there's no appetite for war. However, when the Indian attack began, the left did take this position, or at least large sections of the left, including us, that Pakistan had the right to defend itself against the aggression, against the missiles that were being launched, against the Israeli drones that were hovering above our skies. This was a very menacing situation. And eventually, as is the case with many ironies in history, this tenuous peace was attained through a military confrontation, through the show of strength. Now, of course, this is not a sustainable situation, and to move towards a more sustainable peace, one would have to deal with the underlying problems, which includes the right to self-determination for Kashmiris. Now, on the question of third worldism, I think that might have to do a little bit with how we look at history, and maybe we look at history differently. I don't look at history in terms of a maximalist position on certain things. The Third World Project is a history that I very much align myself with, intellectually, ideologically, historically, knowing that it was inadequate, knowing that it had many contradictions. And that is part of how history moves. One can, whenever one is looking at historical figures, from the best ones to ones who are controversial, there always always must mediate between the contradictory tendencies that exist in those individuals, in those movements, in those moments, in those states. And that's true for all of socialist history. There were things that we would not have liked many governments to do. Indonesia was mentioned. I'm a big fan of Sukarno. But there are many things that one can disagree with Sukarno's government, or Narcis's government, or for that matter, Castro's government in Cuba. These are different, of course, different projects, but there's a lot to agree and a lot to disagree. And history operates through these contradictions. And one thing that one must keep in mind is that what were the big questions of the time that these movements were reacting to, that these individuals were reacting to, and to premise the critique within that historical context. Otherwise, we are always in the danger of creating these very extremely pure models that look very nice in theory, but we will always be frustrated by actual history, because these models can never play out in actual history because of the contradictory nature. And the whole point of political analysis is to see what was progressive and what was regressive in any given moment. A wholesale acceptance or a wholesale rejection both have this danger of losing the dialectical thread that actually creates the movement of history and transitions in history. And it creates the danger of then retreating to theory, which I'm writing a book on something similar as well, something that I've noticed in sections of the left, particularly in the global north, which is this kind of search for a Puritan or a pure revolution, which would never happen. Political projects are always complicated, are always messy, are always undertaken by people who are very inadequate to the tasks of history, because history is too big. And to see what is positive and negative within that complex trajectory can allow us to orient ourselves for politics in the future. Now, one of the comrades asked about, mentioned Professor Marandi and this false flag operation. Now, that's a theory that's quite popular here in Pakistan as well, regarding Pahalgam. Now, whether it was a false flag or not, it's difficult to say, except that it was very tragic, particularly to the people who were targeted. But as Comrade Abid was saying earlier, no Kashmiri freedom fighter, no group that's known or has any serious basis has accepted responsibility. So this, in any case, this parallel that was being drawn with 7th October was false to begin with, because this is not something that anybody is owning. This is not something that was part of anyone's strategy. The strategy of the Kashmiri groups varies, and I would recommend following Stand with Kashmir. It's a group that I follow very closely as well. There are a host of strategies employed, which include the armed struggle, but also include civil society dissent, popular mobilization, international mobilization. And Pahalgam was not owned or acknowledged by any of the legitimate groups in Kashmir. So in that sense, this event was, there was an attempt to turn it into this moment of reckoning through which India could impose collective punishment not only upon Kashmiris and Muslims in India, but also the people of Pakistan. Um, and in fact, the only thing where I would say maybe Professor Varandi's analysis may not be, I haven't heard his part, so I'm not sure exactly what he said, but the US actually did not support India in this latest confrontation. And in fact, there's a lot of anger in India over how Trump announced the ceasefire. Trump did it partly because of his narcissism. He wanted to be the person who brought peace to the region, but India was very upset with how Trump went ahead and announced it. America's role is negative in the broader sense of the term, where it is arming India in the region against China. And this inadvertently puts pressure on all neighboring countries to ramp up their military capacities, to take away our surpluses in the economy and gear them towards weapons. And India not only has poor relations with Pakistan and China, because of this strategy of turning into a regional hegemon on behalf of the US, it has poor relations with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with the Maldives, with Sri Lanka. So it's creating this kind of this kind of pressure across the region in its quest to become a regional hegemon. Now, the only good thing in this this conflict that's emerged is that at least temporarily, India's desire to become a regional hegemon has been buried. It could not create an absolute dominance of the skies vis-a-vis Pakistan. If that had been done, it would have been a disastrous situation, not just for Pakistan. And I genuinely believe we would have had bombs raining down upon us even right now, because there would have been no stopping the way the whole hysteria was created by the Indian media and the Indian government. They would not have stopped before causing very significant damage to our cities. So that arrogance kind of got buried in that conflict. However, in the long run, it's a 10-year strategic partnership that they have with the US. So this will keep putting pressure on the region. And this is where the anti-war movement will become more and more important over time. We are already one of the most poor regions in the world. And if we keep wasting our resources in this kind of arms race that helps the defense industries of the West, but imposes more and more poverty and underdevelopment in our region and upon our people, then not only will we keep lagging behind the world, we will also turn our regions into death zones, even without wars, even without all-out conflicts, because we will be snatching away the resources needed to house people, clothe people, feed people, employ people, towards the killing machines that we recently saw in our skies. So the anti-war movement must be critical. That is also one of the reasons why we chose not to criticize our comrades in India, because we believe that in the long run, we will have to work with them. Even if someone takes one bad position, which is, that does happen in longer political histories, we will have to work with comrades across the border against jingoism, against war hysteria. And most importantly, we will have to raise the issue of Kashmir and turn it into a global issue, which already Stand with Kashmir is doing. But this is where I would also request comrades to raise Kashmir as a central theme, not only because of the the incredible forms of exploitation and violence and oppression that we see in Kashmir, the militarized colonial style occupation that Comrade Abid was speaking of, not only does that impose a moral imperative to raise the issue of Kashmir, but also the issue, its unresolved nature, took the world to the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. For humanity to move forward, we need peace in South Asia. And there can be no peace in South Asia without justice for the people of Kashmir. Hence, our fates and fates of humanity are tied with a just resolution for the Kashmir issue. And that is something that we need to build pressure. We need to speak to left-wing forces across the region. And we need to not only fight jingoism in the region, we need to find a sustainable solution for Kashmir and redirect our energies for fighting the good fights, the internal wars imposed by the ruling classes of Pakistan, India, and the world on the people. That is the message we must take as we go forward in our fight for a better world.